After the show, the departing guests usually have something to say. George Carlin had something to say to us.
From the Tonight Show, why not talk about the Today Show? Hi, Bryant. Hi, Katie. Hi, Willard. Who am I forgetting?
Gene.
Gene. Hi, Gene. Hi, Gene. That's what I'm going home to do right now.
George Carlin outside the Tonight Show studio in 1992, near the end of Johnny Carson's tenure as host. Carlin was a frequent guest of Carson's going back to the early 60s. George Carlin has gone through plenty of changes in his career and in his personal life, but he's been a survivor. He talked about it with NBC's Bryant Gumbel in 1982.
Whenever it happens, people talk about how the great comics are self-destructive. And they list Freddie Prinze and John Belushi and Jonathan Winter's problems and Richard Pryor's problems and now George Carlin's problems. Do you buy much of the theory?
I used to note that comics live a long time. True, Freddie Prinze and John Belushi have screwed up the curve, but you think of Groucho Marx and George Burns and Bob Hope, Milton Berle, and again, we're talking about the famous ones, you know. They seem like there's something happens because humor does something. I mean, it allows you, maybe it helps you conserve life energy.
What about all the things that have come down in recent years? I mean, do you just figure that's the natural order of things, or life's catching up to you, or is there a message there? I mean, the car accident, the cocaine, and the heart attack, and the whole bit. Are you a happy George Carlin at what is it, 45?
Well, I'm happier than I was, say, a year ago, or even 6 months ago. Since the heart attack, I've had to take a very close look at how I manage stress, how I handle it, and apparently not very well in the past. I'm one of those people who denies feelings. No, that's not happening. Couldn't be. No, never mind. What, they did that to me? No sweat. There's another day tomorrow. And I never expressed my anger or my sadness.
You really did feel it. I mean, all of that stuff coming out was just so much of a guise.
I got so good at it. No, but you get so good at it that you don't know you're doing it.
You see, you're kidding yourself.
No, you really think it don't bother me. Hey, don't bother me. And you believe that. But inside, there are chemicals that are taking their toll on you. You know, the stress is working. And we know a lot about stress that we didn't know before. I personally know more about how I've handled it. So when you say, am I a happier George Carlin, I got a lot of reasons to be happier now. First of all, I know not only did that create a problem for me physically, but by learning how to handle the stress, I'm feeling better mentally, too.
It's going so terrific. Do you ever look back at the George Carlin that was 8 years ago and wonder who he was? No?
Well, he's great. He was fine. He was just a little crazier. Just a little, didn't know what he was doing, didn't know what he needed, you know. We had tough years to go through together. I'm talking for my wife and me now together. And I was just responding to being a hit, an overnight, you know, suddenly here's all this stuff happening to me and I had this money. And that takes some adjustment, you know. So he was fine. He was who he needed to be at that time. And I don't worry about him.
He was a kid from 112th Street who was making a lot of money and didn't know what to do with it.
He knew what to do with it. You call the guy. Call the guy and get him, get over here. No, that's essential. That's a fair summation.
Was he angry?
Well, sure, yeah. A lot of anger. Hostility is a better word even. You know, a lot of it came out in the work, too. I can hear it when I listen back to things.
He's back at work again. He's being allowed to work once again, Muhammad Ali. He wasn't for a while, as you know. For about 3.5 years, they didn't let him work. Of course, he had an unusual job, beating people up. Government wanted him to change jobs. Government wanted him to kill people. He said, no, that's where I draw the line.
What they did right.
George Carlin began his career as a comedian in the early 60s in the mainstream world of showbiz. Finding that role too confining, he soon grew his hair, grew a beard, and started doing comedy that was riskier, more anti-establishment, truer to who he really was. It got him thrown out of Las Vegas in 1972. 10 years later, he looked back with Bryant Gumbel on how far comedy had come.
When you look at the contrast, if you look strictly at the contrast of today versus some point 15 years ago, it's obviously there's some, it's somewhat startling to realize it. But because we lived through it, I don't feel it that way. I think of it as a natural progression of the order of things. Playwrights and novelists had the right to use any language they wanted forever. Movies began to take advantage of that at about the same time that stand-up comedians, you know, Lenny Bruce opened the door for stand-up comedians. They had been so uptight about subject matter that all they ever talked about were mother-in-laws and crabgrass, and I mean, there was no creativity to stand-up comedy at all.
Who's the
Richard
best?
Pryor and Lily Tomlin are the two I admire the most that are working now. In terms of people who have done it standing up, there are a lot done it standing up. There are a lot of good comic talents around, and younger, and people who haven't chosen to go on stage with it. People who don't go to nightclubs and start their careers that way. But those two, coming from the same background I did, I admire them.
Why? Why Richard and Lily? Because they're honest? Because they're different?
Honesty
Why?
has a big, that's a big component. They're good at it. I mean, they know what makes them angry and what makes them amused, and they're able to synthesize it, and they give you something that you can really feel and hold on to, you know.
Would it surprise you if I told you that black listeners consider you more black than white?
It would make me feel good, because I came from a neighborhood where we tried to be black an awful lot for at least a year or so there in our teenage years. We lived right close to Harlem, right on the edge of what would be called West Harlem. And it was cool. You know, we knew that black guys were cool. I mean, you could just see it when they walked down the street, you know. And Irish guys, being Catholic and being Irish, you get, you know, so uptight and so white, you know. But guys would be standing around, you know, which I've said on the album, of course, guys with red hair and freckles would be saying, "Hey, what's to it? What's happening? Nothing to it? You're all right. I'll be back. Catch you in a minute." And the guy's named McLaughlin, you know. So, yeah, I always felt a kinship. I don't know where, except from the neighborhood. I guess that's where it came from,
yeah.
The underdog kinship, you know.
Do you still feel the same way about establishment and tradition and as you once did, or has that changed too? I mean, is that part of the revamped George Carlin?
In terms of the establishment, philosophically, I mean, if you put it on paper, the whole system stinks. I mean, the whole idea of greed and profit and the exploitation of other people, it stinks. But you can't, if you can't do anything about it, you can't give yourself heart attacks over it. It's okay to disagree about it, but to watch the news and to see the figures who are responsible for this on videotape, or see them on film, see them have their meetings, or see them giving a little speech, to let that fire you up, that's dangerous. So I can look at them now and I can say, too bad, you know? I mean, it's really too bad that we're in this, but I can't get angry about it now.
But as we sit here, it has worked terrific for George Carlin. I mean, we're in a sumptuous suite, and you're going to go on over to Carnegie Hall and do something for cable.
You mean taking an anti-establishment posture has worked for me?
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
I'm not saying it's hypocritical. I'm
No.
just saying it's worked terrific for you.
Absolutely. But I don't have to be angry internally in order for me to make observations that are pertinent and then to put them into words. I can say things on a stage without feeling a knot in my stomach.
What's on the tube today must provide plenty of food for comedy.
Well, I don't
the
watch
way we handle news nowadays.
Oh, yeah, but gosh, is there going to be any room for entertainment? I mean, soon the news will start at noon, and I don't know, but there's no news in it. You watch for a whole hour, and it's, you know, how to make a fig, or how to buy a thing you need, and then you get back. I know, yes, 7 people were killed, but let's not worry about that. Now we're going to show you how to buy vegetables, you know. It's just a strange newscast now.
George Carlin in 1982. When we return in a moment, a look back at a defining moment in Carlin's career, the 7 dirty words.
No matter what George Carlin we're talking about, no matter what point in time, the common thread as I see it is this intense eye for the language, this acute feel for the language, the ability to mimic and exaggerate speech patterns, inanities. Yeah, you always had a bullseye sort of focus on that.
You know, to be, I don't want to take myself too seriously, because I really don't, down deep. But I like being serious about things that I talk about. And I see, you know, language is really the only thing we have when you get right down to it. Here we have these terrifically advanced brains full of ideas and reasoning and conceptual things, and the only way to share with one another is through this system of codes that we have. And when language is abused or overused and sort of misused, it's something that, I won't say it bothers me, I don't lose sleep over it, but it's something I like to show that I can correct, or that I can perceive correctly. And it has to do with not finishing school, I know it does.
What did it feel like? What were the differences in the feeling you got from standing on a stage in Vegas, let's say, and going over big? Big applause, big laughs, and standing on stage at the University of Wisconsin and killing that audience a few years later?
Well, the big difference was that I felt I was speaking from my gut rather than the front of my head. The Vegas stuff in those years were an exercise in repressing my real feelings and trying to be, you know, something a little fake. The other thing was the greatest reward a person can ask for, and that's to be somehow cheered and liked or loved, or whatever word's right for it, for being yourself and for having something inside you that when it got out, people were happy about it. I got my first, I don't know, I guess every performer knows when they got their first standing ovation. You know, I really don't want to lapse here into a lot of self-congratulation, but I remember Santa Monica City College, a little amphitheater, and Spirit was the band, and Mort Saul was supposed to be the headliner, and he had to cancel, and I was put in at the last minute. And I was already into my new things, but nobody really knew that yet. And I went out there, and I thought they'd be really disappointed that Mort wasn't there, and I'd have to really struggle. So I just did all my stuff, my 30 or 45 or whatever I had, and they all stood up and cheered, and that was the moment that I knew that I was answering the correct part of my body by, you know, by getting out and saying what was on my gut, in my gut.
Welcome back to Time and Again, as we spent some time with comedian George Carlin over the years by way of the NBC News archives. We identify comedians by their classic routines. Laurel and Hardy trying to move that piano. Abbott and Costello asking, who's on first? Steve Martin is the wild and crazy guy. George Carlin is no exception. Many of his routines are familiar to generations of fans. His most notorious by far, the 7 words you can never use on television, better known as the 7 dirty words. It got him arrested more than once in the early 70s, and a broadcast of the routine triggered a landmark obscenity case that went all the way to the Supreme Court.
The United States Supreme Court says that the public airways, television, radio, and other forms of broadcasting are not the place for what it calls dirty words. The court says that the Federal Communications Commission may restrict the broadcast of indecent language, but lacking the power to censor, the FCC must punish in some way broadcasters who are in violation. A New York radio station forced this issue. It played a recording in which comedian George Carlin used 7 dirty words. Roy Neal picks up the story.
George Carlin was guest host last night on The Tonight Show, where he talked about the Supreme Court decision.
The words are crude, there's no question. We have made them that. But whether they should be illegal, whether or not we should be enjoined from using them, even on radio and television, which is a limited and a different sort of field of expression, I don't agree myself personally. But that's why they call it an opinion. The Supreme Court only has their opinion. That's your opinion.
Those men
I got my
decided
opinion.
that. They got their opinion.
And what do they know?
Yeah.
Before doing The Tonight Show, Carlin held a news conference to explain his point of view.
The FCC has stepped in and said, we don't think you can censor yourselves, that you can edit yourselves for the decency standards. We think we have to impose that. This board of men who was appointed by a president and established by the Congress. The First Amendment really didn't allow for them, as far as I can see.
That was 1978. 12 years later, when Carlin spoke with NBC's Bob Costas, the 7 dirty words controversy was still a vivid memory.
Carlin, let's get right to it, because almost everybody remembers this incident, at least those who were old enough to observe it at the time. The 7 words you can't use on television.
Yeah.
And for using those words on stage, you wound up being arrested in Milwaukee.
Right. Actually, the whole tone of my act was probably, as well as that specific bit. What happened in Milwaukee was that we were doing a concert in an outdoor setting that included more than just that concert. It was a summer fest. And there were maybe, 30,000 or 40,000 people doing other things. And as they would come by with their prams and their children in strollers, the sound from our concert bled over into the other public areas. And so the policeman took action because he thought that language was infecting those other people. It was a disorderly conduct charge eventually, and it was thrown out.
Wasn't there a challenge, though, by the FCC? Because at least some radio stations played the cut off the album, and the FCC objected, and then what happened?
WBAI in New York played the second version of the 7 Words. 7 Words was on the Class Clown album. The next album was called Occupation Fool, and it had a thing called Filthy Words, which was a sequel. And they played it on a program in the afternoon, whereby they announced beforehand, this might be objectionable to some people. They played it in the context of what it was, and that was, it was a monologue about language restrictions and how hypocritical it is. And so it was perfectly in context with, you know, the Miller test of obscenity. It had redeeming artistic value. And the FCC, some parent heard it. What he was doing with his child in the car during school hours, I don't know, but his child was in the car. The child was 14. He was a professional moralist. He was a member of some organization, which name I've forgotten. He complained to the FCC. One person in a market of 15 million, maybe, one person complained. The FCC sanctioned the station, I think, with a fine. Station, because it's a very, you know, it's listener-supported and very liberal station, refused to pay the fine. Won the case in district court and lost when the FCC took the case to the Supreme Court. The case was lost there. I was a sort of an interested third party. It was the station against the FCC.
Just give me the rules so I can play by them. Was your comedy premise?
Right. That was the comedy, as you say, tongue-in-cheek, but with I think a strong piece of logic supporting it, as you're implying, I think. You see, the thing is, it seems to me that if you can say on a television show intercourse, and you can talk about that act between a man and a woman, or between whoever happens to be around, but if you can mention that act, then the act is allowable. You can talk about the act. If you can talk about the act and call it one thing, then it's not the act. It has to be the word. And that's what I always question. Why does one word have more power than another word? Because it's vulgar. That's all. Because, well, nice people don't say that in nice mixed company. Those seem to me to be very, very, very loose standards to be codified into law. I mean, granted, we don't do those things because we have manners in mixed company or whatever the situation is. We don't say those things in the parlor. That's fine, we choose that. But for the law to say that word for that act is an okay word, that word for that act is not, I don't follow that logic at all. That seems to me like very unnecessarily restrictive.
That was 1990, years after the 7 Dirty Words controversy. But George Carlin was still using his comedy to explore the issues it raised. The day before that interview with Bob Costas, Carlin was Bryant Gumbel's guest on Today.
Back in the 70s, George Carlin humorously gave us the 7 dirty words you couldn't say on television. Now, 20 years later, this elder statesman of counterculture comedy has an updated look at language he finds offensive. It's all part of his latest album called Parental Advisory Explicit Lyrics. George Carlin, good morning.
How you doing, Bryant?
I'm fine. You know, 3 of those 7 now you can hear on TV in some sections.
Yeah, you hear them on, and we're talking about broadcast television. When I first said that, there wasn't
No, we couldn't sit here and do this.
Right. But you do hear them occasionally, yeah.
Yeah. You still find language kind of fascinating, though, don't you?
Yeah, my mom and dad both had a gift for speech and for investigating words, and I understand my grandfather was the same way, and I think there's a genetic component there. But she always sent me to the dictionary. My mother always sent me to look it up. Look that word up. Make sure you know how to use that word.
You don't like the softening of the language that's going on?
I don't like the euphemism. You know, that bothers me. The language should be obviously used to express and reveal. And it's used a lot to conceal and to cover over and to obfuscate government, lawyers, politicians. Everything seems to be to try, you know, politicians don't say anything anymore, they indicate.
Yeah.
I indicated that I had made a judgment. Instead of saying I thought, I decided, you know. That bothers me, and then the trendiness, the overuse of trendy words.
Yeah. It's not just comedy that trips your trigger these days, it is also acting. There was a time when you were more enamored with acting than with comedy. Still?
Well, as a little boy, I wanted to be like Danny Kaye or Bob Hope or Red Skelton in the movies, and I called that acting. I mean, to me, I didn't think of Spencer Tracy when I said I want to be an actor when I grow up. I wanted to be in the movies and be funny.
When we come back, more of Bob Costas' one-on-one with George Carlin, talking about his early days and how he became a comedian in the first place.
Did it get you out of a lot of trouble, the ability to be funny?
Well,
to think on your feet?
Yeah, of course. And I was, a lot of the time when there would be 3 or 4 of us, we grew up next to Columbia University, and we used the entire campus, including Grant's Tomb and Riverside Church and Juilliard School of Music and Barnard and St. John the Divine. All of these institutional buildings we used as our playgrounds. And we stole things from them too, and we created a lot of vandalism and havoc. But when we'd be caught, there'd be 2 or 3 of us, you know, they'd finally collar us. Yeah. Georgie, do the talking. You do the talking, Georgie. And you'd have to come up with a good BS story for the guard, you know, to try to get out of it. In terms of on the street itself, it was toward the end of gangbusting days for Irish kids. There wasn't, the guys a little older than us, my brother's gang, and then they got into a little more of gang fighting stuff than we did. We were somehow not part of that. I could tell you why in another context, but for now, all you have to know is that. And we were more like party guys, and we were into black music, the rhythm and blues of the early 50s, not rock and roll, but the hallway groups, I call them, the Clovers, the Drifters, and those guys, early stuff. And because we weren't, you know, big fighters, I didn't have to prove myself as a tough guy. And the way I got by was with my jokes and with my playing the dozens, being quick to slip. There were a lot of fast minds on that street corner. You had to get in there. We called them slip fights, the dozens, talking about each other's mothers, you know.
When did the notion first hit you that you were funny?
Well, my mother, my father wasn't around, but he was a very funny man, gifted verbally. He was a public speaker and an ad salesman. My mother told me a lot about that, and she was very gifted verbally. She could come home from a bus ride and do 7 characters on the bus and tell you a terrific story with a punchline. So there's some genetic thing there, and you pick it up. Mm-hmm. But when she taught me how to imitate Mae West. I had never seen her, of course. This is the early 1940s. But she taught me how to say, "Come up and see me sometime."
Yeah.
And I would, you know, I'd do it for company. And there was Johnny the Philip Morris midget, who was an advertising symbol then. Call for Philip Morris. Well, between those 2 things, that was quite an act. And I noticed that people gave me their attention and their approval, and I think I needed that.
Were you a class clown? One of your albums was entitled Class Clown.
Yeah, because, you know, the work was fairly easy. I didn't have a lot of trouble with the schoolwork, and I was a bit bored, and I'd look around, and I'd be making noises or faces or smart remarks, you know, when an open question would hang in the air. And so, sure, I got my approval. That was it, my attention and approval. And I didn't have a lot of it at home because with my father nowhere, I mean, my mother had to leave him. It didn't work a lot very well, I guess. So she had to work, and she wasn't there.
I think you said somewhere in an interview some years ago that you were raised by your mom, mm-hmm. by your friends in the streets of New York, yeah. and also in a very real sense raised by the radio.
Yeah, I found out something only a few years ago that there were, besides the adventure shows and besides the comedy shows, which I loved, there were shows like Fibber McGee, which was comedy, Fibber McGee, Date with Judy, Corliss Archer, shows that were what you'd call situation comedies on radio. And they had these families and these small towns and the sense of family and community. And I didn't realize until I was an adult and I was actually doing some therapy that was my sort of extended imaginary family. That's what I belonged to. I found when I was in my 20s, driving through small towns in the Midwest, I found a feeling I couldn't explain to myself of being very at home. And here's a kid from Harlem, you know, cityfied and loves the city and all its ways. And here I was in Decatur, Illinois, and feeling, God, there's something happening here. And that's what it was. That radio was a way for me to have some people to hold on to.
There was always the voice inflection of a broadcaster running through your routines, whether it was the early George Carlin that people got to know on Merv Griffin and The Tonight Show, the straight George Carlin, whether it was what was commonly called the hippie George Carlin, that broadcaster's voice, that ability to switch into that sort of unreal inflection.
Yes, that unctuous thing where we say, you know, I'm not really being sincere, but this is the way I view sincerity. Or the disc jockey with the big sounds, the big charts, and the big tunes. That sort of put-on voice, yeah. you know, I was a disc jockey. I was a formula jock on a top 40 station when they first were starting in '56. That's when I began in radio, and rock and roll was just starting, so the two things were kind of coming of age together, and I was in on the ground floor. I was in Louisiana at a #1 station in the market in Shreveport, and it was a little looser than some of the stuff got later. You know how tight the formats got. It was a little looser than that, but I talked, see, when I showed up in Louisiana, I still had my New York accent. I still have some tapes that I would talk to my mother, and I would say, "Ma, look at my haircut." She says, "Where'd you get that haircut?" I said, "Look, Ma, this is the haircut I got. Do you like this?" And I guess I consciously tried to lose that. So it became easy to imitate an exaggerated version of the non-regional voice.
And that, of course, is where Wonderful Wino came from, the big sound in the big town.
Big sounds, the big tunes, the big sound. Yeah, Willie West, Wonderful Wino. You know, I was, later on that station went highly formula. Time, temperature, and mention the artist and get into the next record. So I had about 3 or 4 months of trying to act like one of those sort of mindless jocks.
Yeah, Wino time, bing bong, and it was always the same time, 5 minutes past the big hour, 7 o'clock.
Right.
But it was the same time throughout the whole bit.
And all of the jingles with Wonderful Wino.
I'm here in Washington, D.C. because I want women to know that the government has quota programs for women entrepreneurs who need money to start or expand a business. You know why? Because 2 out of every 3 businesses that start today are started by women. And women are more successful at starting businesses than men are. Women can get grants, loans, contracts, and free help to start any kind of business.
And what did you get?
I got a government contract for $3 million. Oh
my.
Wow.
There's money for rich women. There's money for low-income women. There's even money for child care while you take classes to start your own business.
And you?
I got over $2 million in government contracts in my training company.
And you?
$400,000 in sales.
And you?
A $50,000 loan to purchase my warehouse.
If you're a woman, you should be spending more time doing the things you love, and I'll show you how to get the money and help to do it.
Call 1-800-518-7667. That's 1-800-518-7667 and get your share of government money. Money back guaranteed. If not completely satisfied, order now.
In the days of the straight George Carlin, of the mid to late 60s,
yes,
you weren't that sort of comedian that you generally saw on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Right.
There was still a cutting edge to some of that material, and there was a certain kind of intelligence to it that appealed to people beyond what you yourself looked like.
You see, I was sort of in hiding during that period. I had come out of coffee houses a few years earlier, and coffee houses were very liberal and left-leaning, let's, again, to use simpler labels. Folk audiences allowed you to experiment and do things that you wouldn't get away with in nightclubs. You could die in front of them and work things out, which I did in Greenwich Village. So when I was in that period of Sullivan and those late 60s, see, my dream was to be like a Danny Kaye or a Bob Hope or a Red Skelton, to be in the movies and be funny. And I thought, I was on automatic pilot. I thought, well, I've done the radio. That was phase 1. This is 11 years old, I decided. Phase 1 is radio, phase 2 is stand-up, then they got to let me in the movies, phase 3. Well, there I was in the middle of being Mr. Stand-Up, and I thought, well, got to get ready for phase 3. And in order to get into sitcoms or movies and be this kind of comic actor that I wanted to be, I figured, and I never said this consciously to myself, but somehow I said to myself, I've got to play their game. I've got to be one of their guys. I've got to go along to get along. So I did a sort of, I think, of a superficial comedy. I think it was good, and I think it made some good points along the way, but compared to what I was sort of feeling in here, it was a bit skimming on the surface, and that's that period that you talk about. And it's true, because I would get very subversive occasionally. I mean, Al Sleet, the hippy-dippy weatherman, was certainly not a wine drinker. We all know that. Yeah. And long before marijuana was tolerated to the level it was, say, in the early 70s or whatever, he was, you know, going, hey, what's happening? We got a Mexican high and a Canadian low.
Do you think you're as funny now as you were in the 70s and 60s?
I'm doing my best work. I'm the only one that can ever really be the judge, because I do it for myself. You know, the fact that the audience is there is wonderful, and nothing would be complete. You know, couldn't do it without them. But I do it for me. And I'm thinking better than I ever have. And my observations, I think, stand out in better, you know, relief. against what I already know. That's what it is, you know, about life. I found out now that I'm 53. You collect this sort of matrix of information, and it gets more textured and full as you get older, and therefore the things you see today are compared more accurately with the background stuff. And I think I'm having more fun with it than I ever have. I know that.
Some of us, I'm sure some of the people out there caught you on HBO with the Doing It Again
yeah, they played
special.
it again recently, in fact.
Yeah. Where do you think, and I know that this is going to put you in a position where you might sound pretentious, and I apologize for that. Where do you think you rank historically? Because at about the time that you had your greatest success, there certainly was a fork in the road in terms of what was acceptable to wide audiences in comedy, and you were part of that cavalry charge.
Well, I walked, and Richard Pryor walked, and later guys have walked through the doors that Lenny Bruce opened up in the middle of all of his genius and torture that sort of went together. I don't know. That's certainly, you know, I'm proud that I was able to somehow mix commercial success with ideas that certainly previously weren't that successful commercially. I don't know. You know, I'm just happy that I was there. I don't have any idea how to answer the question, even if I were to be terrifically pretentious about it. It's for another person to judge.
When we come back, you can judge for yourself. George Carlin in a classic bit of comedy on the difference between baseball and football in a moment.
You knew I wouldn't overlook the difference between baseball and football. Now, in my opinion, there have been a lot of great things written extolling the virtues of baseball. Roger Angell, John Updike on Ted Williams' last turn at bat, Art Giamatti's work. But in a way, that little bit of yours says it as well as anything.
Well, thank you. There's a newer version of it. You keep ideas keep occurring to you, usually if your subject matter is broad enough. And there are a couple of things I've added to the baseball and football comparison. Of course, the original line is baseball is a 19th century pastoral game. Football is a 20th century technological struggle. Baseball is played on a diamond in a park, the baseball park. Football is played on a gridiron in a stadium, sometimes called Soldier Field or War Memorial Stadium. Do we really have time for the rest?
Absolutely.
Let's try it. Then this is a newer line. Baseball begins in the spring, the season of new life. Football begins in the fall when everything is dying. In football, you wear a helmet. In baseball, you wear a cap. Football is concerned with downs. What down is it? Baseball is concerned with ups. Who's up? Are you up? I'm not up. He's up. In football, you receive a penalty. In baseball, you make an error. Whoops. Football has hitting, clipping, spearing, piling on, personal fouls, late hitting, and unnecessary roughness. Baseball has the sacrifice. Football is played in any kind of weather: rain, snow, sleet, hail, fog, can't see the game, don't know if there is a game going on, mud on the field, can't read the uniforms, can't read the yard markers, the struggle will continue. In baseball, if it rains, we don't go out to play. I can't come out. It's raining out. Baseball has the 7th inning stretch. Football has the 2-minute warning. Baseball has no time limit. We don't know when it's going to end. We might have extra innings. Football is rigidly timed, and it will end, even if we have to go to sudden death. In baseball, during the game in the stands, there's kind of a picnic feeling. Emotions may run high or low, but there's not that much unpleasantness. In football, during the game in the stands, you can be sure that at least 27 times you're perfectly capable of taking the life of a fellow human being, preferably a stranger. And finally, the objectives of the two games are completely different. In football, the object is for the quarterback, otherwise known as the field general, to be on target with his aerial assault, riddling the defense by hitting his receivers with deadly accuracy in spite of the blitz, even if he has to use the shotgun. With short bullet passes and long bombs, he marches his troops into enemy territory, balancing this aerial assault with a sustained ground attack which punches holes in the forward wall of the enemy's defensive line. In baseball, the object is to go home and to be safe. I hope I'll be safe at home. End of comparison.
For 4 decades, George Carlin has been one of the funniest guys around because he's also one of the smartest, most honest guys around. Not always an easy job, but Carlin is a survivor. In 1997, he turned 60, just one day after the death of his wife of more than 30 years. Carlin has outlasted changing trends, outlived drug abuse and health problems, all the while keeping his comedy sharp, relevant, and above all funny. And that's no joke. That's Time and Again for now. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Pauley, and we're History.